Okay, so following up from the Switch 2 reveal, there's been a range of disclosures. Oliver's been keeping track of them, told me earlier he's having trouble keeping up with the sheer range of stuff that is quote unquote dropping. But you've highlighted a few things here based on hands-on impressions and disclosures from Nintendo.
Yes.
In terms of hands-on, we haven't done hands-on, which is interesting, but that is coming soon, don't worry. But Oliver, take it away.
So yeah, there are some things here that came from Nintendo, but there are some things that came from hands-on impressions. And I thought one thing that might be important to start off with is a bit of a clarification to some of our earlier remarks about the Switch 2's display. Because I know originally we had suspected mini LED, but judging from various impressions from various journalists who've had their hands on Switch 2 hardware, they all say that the contrast is noticeably worse than Switch OLED. Now, if it was a mini LED with properly functioning and numerous dimming zones, like hundreds of dimming zones, that wouldn't really be the case, because mini LED can achieve extremely high contrast if the content warrants it, with visually speaking close to infinite contrast. Like it's very, very compelling. If you're getting that proper dimming zone arrangement there, it should look fine. There's also some critical visual evidence that has come out very recently of the Switch 2 screen in dark content that I've seen. And it's hard to say with these matters, but it does have a bit of a gray cast to the blacks. You're seeing the Switch 2 unit. It's got a visibly black border around it. It's got a game over screen, I think in Zelda, in Breath of the Wild. And then you've got this gray screen around it. Very kind of backlit, kind of almost an IPS glow look to it. It's definitely not a fully dimmed screen around those elements, right? It's a fully backlit screen there. So yeah, they do report it's brighter and it's a lot better than the original Switch display. I certainly can see that in some of the photographs that have been published. I could also imagine that it could cover like the DCI P3 display color space there pretty credibly there relative to that original Switch display, which did not have very good color reproduction. But in a scene that, say, demanded really intense localized brightness, like say in the Mario Kart games, you're looking at the sun, could it really reach that super high brightness level without watching out the picture? Or in a cave illuminated by like a flashlight, could it credibly depict that bright flashlight and then the darkness of the surrounding cave, right? These are kind of the content scenarios that we're concerned about for HDR content sometimes. And I would doubt that would be the case based on all the visual evidence and all the text evidence that we have from various journalists. But I would expect, like on the flip side of things, I would expect they probably have some pretty good tone mapping and a pretty good tone curve that is optimized for the panel and HDR content on the panel. And it could still look okay. It could still be an okay HDR experience, even an HDR experience that's preferable to an SDR experience in the same panel. But my impressions so far are that it's probably actually not a mini LED panel. This is not like the end all be all of mobile displays that we suspected it might be. This is probably probably a very good LCD panel. It's got a lot of great technologies here, 120 hertz VRR, that matters a lot here. Nice, sharp, crisp 7.9 inch 1080p display. But it seems more like a very bright LCD that has a laundry list of supported features here, rather than like a really high-end mini LED panel that's really like pushing out the forefront of mobile gaming technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting that something that came up in the NVIDIA blog there is that the VRR is seemingly G-Sync. They've actually integrated G-Sync there. So that actually sets my mind at rest a great deal on stuff like low frame rate compensation being done properly.
Yes, that's interesting. Yeah, the G-Sync brand, nowadays it's not as the same. It still carries weight, at least in the certain aspects of it's better than HDMI 2.1's VRR.
Oliver, let's talk about local game streaming with game share, because it's not quite what we initially thought it was going to be, right?
Yeah. So this is basically a callback to a feature available on the Nintendo DS, which was download play. So I assumed this was more like download play, at least initially. And that's a feature where basically you would transmit, a game, a portion of your, Mario Kart DS or whatever, to other DS players locally. Now, in the case of DS games, that would probably only be a few megabytes. We're dealing with 16 megabyte cartridges, 32 megabyte cartridges in some cases for those titles. Probably not transmitting a whole lot of data, right, across the network, across the local network for those games. The problem with this system is obviously it doesn't really scale with very large games, very large downloads, doesn't really seem to, at least. Games have such detailed assets nowadays. You might be transmitting multiple gigabytes to play very many games there. So that is not really a functional solution, I would suspect, for most games, especially if you just want to pick up and play something. So the solution that Nintendo has come up with here is local game streaming, effectively, where a Switch 2 unit streams a game to other Switch 2 units or Switch 1 units. Switch 1 units will also work. So you can play Switch 2 software on a Switch 1 using this game streaming feature, which is pretty cool. The challenge here is that it seems to mostly work with games that can render like the same screen, same view for all players. So you can imagine like a game of Super Smash Brothers where everyone is seeing the same stage at all times and all players in that stage. You don't need to have multiple viewports or whatever. That would work in theory under this system, although latency would be a concern and image quality would be a concern. But that would work theoretically. But there are games here that are mentioned where game share is rendering out multiple scenes. So in Clubhouse games, for instance, you're playing a card game. Each player gets their own screen when playing their cards. There's no screen peeking here going on here. You don't need to constrain your view to one section of the screen. It's rendering out multiple viewports there. But obviously there are some drawbacks. They mentioned latency is a concern, quality is a concern. So they basically say like this is only really going to work with games where those issues related to streaming quality aren't as much of a concern. I think this is a cool technological solution to an age-old problem and probably provides a pretty hassle-free solution for multiplayer when only one player owns the game and has the game installed. There are trade-offs. It's not as neat and integrated and like low latency and responsive, I'm sure, as a solution like game streaming was on the Wii U, but this seems flexible and probably appropriate for a pretty good number of games here. This also apparently works over the internet. It's not just local play. It also apparently works over the internet. And there, again, it is a streamed solution. So I'd be curious to see exactly what latency looks like on that end of the spectrum, exactly what image quality looks like on that end of the spectrum. But there, again, presumably you're dealing with games that are less latency sensitive. So you're like turn-based games, slower paced games, things like this. Probably not your WarioWares, even though that seems like it would otherwise be ideally suited to this. Probably just like these slower paced games that would really be able to work over a network without it being a complete wreck, I suppose.
Right. Okay. So I guess, but in a more local environment, I wonder if the switches are talking to each other directly or via the router/router.
I think it's local because they didn't mention needing a Wi-Fi network nearby or something. So
right.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. I think I'd worry about that based on, for example, the remote play on PlayStation 5, which latency isn't great there. I mean, from my perspective, they announce a feature called Game Share, and it's like, wow, this is great. I can share my games, but ultimately, it actually seems to be, well, you could share your games if they're supported, B, if the content is appropriate to the streaming method that's being used. I can't imagine Fast Fusion being working particularly well or anything like that. So it's not quite as impressive or feature rich as I was perhaps hoping. But at the same time, I kind of like the idea that you can actually stream to a Switch 1, because there's going to be a big bunch of people out there who are not looking to throw away their Switch 1s. They're probably looking to pass it on to another family member or something like that. So I think it's quite an interesting feature.
And the beautiful thing with Nintendo too is it's not like some generic game streaming feature that just works with every single game, and it might be a good experience or it might be a bad experience. Nintendo is building carefully curated, crafted experiences that do work well over game streaming and are probably enjoyable and hopefully delightful experiences to have with your friends. They're building this up to be a carefully built feature for specific experiences.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts on this, Alex?
No, not so much. I've taken advantage of in-home streaming with Steam. If it's really your bag, then it's your bag. Yeah.
There were rumors, in fact, for the clock speeds of the Switch 2, and there is still the mystery of the fact that the CPU seems to be clocked higher in mobile mode than it is in docked mode. I'm wondering if it's anything related to that. I'm thinking not, because you'd assume that Game Share would still work with docked mode, right? That would make sense. So there is still that mystery to clear up, I think, assuming that data is in fact accurate.
Yeah.
So, interesting.